Recently, I saw an Instagram page posting some really interesting stuff about the original 10th Mountain Division. We got to talking and come to find out Mr. Blythe is a historian and is releasing a book about the history of mountain warfare. So, sir, would you mind introducing yourself?
So the name's Lance Blyth. I'm an adjunct professor of history at United States Air Force Academy. I adjunct because my day job is as the command historian for NORAD and U.S. Northern Command here in Colorado Springs. So on that vein, everything I have here is my own opinion. Doesn't reflect anything official of anybody. I explain myself as a backcountry skier with a history problem, and basically to excuse the amount of time I spend in the mountains most of the year, I ended up researching and writing a book called Ski Climb Fight, 10th Mountain Division and the Rise of Mountain Warfare that will be coming out from the University of Oklahoma Press, published in November, available for pre-order at your favorite retail outlet.
So, I've had some minor involvement with the 10th Mountain Division. The 86th Brigade of the Vermont National Guard patched over to the 10th Mountain Division for a few years. I actually wore that patch when I went to the Swiss mountaineering course, and I thought it was an honor to be climbing in the Alps while wearing that patch. There's a lot of history there. I've read several books about the 10th Mountain Division. I'm curious why you wrote a book about the 10th Mountain Division, and did your background as a mountaineer help you with it?
Yeah, so the origination story is actually I can trace it back to the very moment because of a picture. It was a picture of myself putting hand warmers in January of 2019 on a very cold day on a ski tour on Chicago Ridge. It was a pretty spicy avalanche conditions, 4 out of 5s on east facing, and that part of Chicago Ridge is west facing, and the wind load snow comes in, so it's low angle. It's a place you can go on a day like that. But yeah, but it's a wind load, so we're punching through the snow, getting up, found a decent line to ski, but I completely screwed up my transitions and my hands were freezing. So I stopped to put in hand warmers, and then just to get my mind off of anything, off of my misery as we were starting to skin back up, I could see out and look north down the valley and see hail. And I was like, how did they do this? What did they do? What did they use? What were their skills? What are their techniques? I was at that point was really learning try how to telemark ski. So doing a lot of lessons um, workshops and stuff to try to get those skills. So I was thinking about those kinds of things. So I went back and started reading a lot of the same books. McKay Jenkins' The Last Ridge, Maurice Iserman's book, Winter Warriors, came out that same year. So I picked that up, but I couldn't find what I was looking for. I couldn't find the level of detail I wanted. So I start searching around, and I'm a historian, so I started following the footnotes and went, oh, well, I guess I should write a book on this thing if I'm going to do it. Um, but what I realized and why I decided to write a book was that most of the history written on 10th Mountain Division were not, ironically, military histories. And that being, as I teach cadets, that's histories of the creation and employment of armed force. They used a lot of the great stories that these guys left behind for us. I mean, they wrote home and they kept their letters and they knew they were doing something unique, so they maintained it. And people done a great amount of stuff with that. And I was like, okay, let's put this back into this larger context, this larger military history context, and that is mountain warfare. So again, being a academic or academic adjacent, I did a lot of overthinking about what is mountain warfare, and really settled finally upon Karl von Clausewitz's understanding that mountains introduce what he called a retarding element. I need to find which German word because that he used. I need to find out. That's how it's translated. And it's because and everyone, think about this. When you add in the cumulative effects of slope, of steepness, of climate, of elevation, and the altitude, the effect on the body, it makes it harder. So military forces to maneuver in the mountains have to be able to survive and be mobile in the mountains. And the thing that I discovered, and going into your second, really the second question was that those two things, survival, mobility, really rely upon skills and techniques and gear that are resonant in the civilian skiing and mountaineering communities. That is really unique about mountain warfare. There's no other environmental form of warfare, jungle, amphibious, what have you, where your basic civilian weekend warrior has better gear and skills to do the thing than the military does. And the U.S. military has gone out, and all the militaries have. I mean, this goes back to the 19th century that has with that one. So while I don't think of myself as a mountaineer, again, more of just a backcountry skier, did do a lot of rock climbing. I went to University of Wyoming back in the 80s. We had Vita Vu right up the road, so we did a lot of climbing there. Some of my friends were in Army ROTC, so had access to the ropes and stuff like that. So we would go do that. I spent early 90s in the Marine Corps as an infantry officer, and my company was a small boat raid company, and that also gave us the cliff assault mission. And so we actually were trained to and had assault climbers trained to do cliff assaults. And we spent several weeks in the Sierra Nevada there, Pickle Meadows, learning how to do that. So, and then did a one or two on the way to the first Gulf War in the Philippines. We did a couple where there's no rules once you're out of these states, and so we did some of that one. So, um, I tend to kind of prefer my time when I'm out in the mountains in the high alpine, do a lot of, just hiking and scrambling. And a few years ago, well, I got back to Colorado in 2007, realized after some time in the Southwest, remembered that, oh, summer's only here for about 3 months. The rest of the time there's up high, you're dealing with snow. So that's how I ended up going to a lot into backcountry skiing around a lot of the mountaineering. My wife works as the operations and guide manager for our local Pikes Peak Alpine School here in Colorado Springs. So I interact with the guides and that quite a bit with that one. So it did help with the writing to finally answer your question. I kind of knew which questions to ask, and many of which had never been asked. Um, how wide were the skis? No one had ever recorded that. Chris Jurgens was the curator at the History Colorado when he did the Winter Warriors exhibit that is still there. He was looking at his notes and saying we never measured it. Is that important? Yes, for skiers, that's one of the questions they're always going to ask. What knots? What was their climbing? Um, what? But I knew that had to be there in the materials because that's the military records all that kind of thing. So I was able to go through with all of that. And I've also have had to spend a lot of time around hail, summer and winter, skiing, Vail Pass area or back in there, or gravel biking or whatever. So that in many ways did, because I knew the terrain and knew the basics of what they were doing. So it did help me know what questions to ask and know that there were answers to those questions.
Yeah, that's really interesting because as someone who uses the gear, those are questions I've always had. What skis did they use? What were their bindings like? What pitons did they use? Books that I've read go over like the big picture of the formation of the unit, but don't really have all the details that I want to know. So it'll be interesting to hear about what you've discovered. Speaking of, was there anything in your research that surprised you?
Yeah, it did. Really, four things surprised me. The first thing is I kind of went in with the standard story of Minnie Dole and all of that, which is a story that Dole told. Now, in his defense, he didn't know a lot of the stuff that was going on behind the scenes. It remained classified in many cases, many of the war plans until the 1970s. So he couldn't have known. Not a crack on Dole. But the Army did know about mountain warfare. Now, they didn't know much, but they did know about it. They read translations of foreign articles and foreign books, mainly German. There were staff colleges map exercises in 34 and 35 on mountain warfare. Now, mind you, they were using more of a North African Rif war that was going on at that time as a basis for it, but they were looking at it. There were articles in professional journals. The Army no military engineer it's a journal that was both military professionals and civilian professionals, but There was an article in there from 37 or 38 that was like this incredible encapsulation of everything that they knew about mountain warfare at the time, and it was clearly read. So it was there. And if you go back and start looking at doctrine, and this is where we go into military history, yes, we see the Field Manual 100-5 of 1939 that George Marshall signs out as a section on mountain warfare. It's small, it's basic, but it is there. So the Army does have an understanding that they're going to need to do it. In the summer of 1940, they're thinking, well, maybe 3 divisions for mountain divisions. They had no idea what those are going to look like. They had no idea what they were going to need for them. They they didn't know what they were going to need for armored divisions at the time. They experimented throughout the war. Um, in 1940, there was a summer of 1940, France falls and the U.S. Army starts going, we may need to occupy most of the Northern Hemisphere in defensive preparation. So maybe we should send forces to Greenland, to Newfoundland, with Canadian, allied with the Canadians up to Alaska. And maybe they should ski. So in July of 1940, which is 2 months before Dole meets with Marshall, they've already telling people go out and do ski patrols. The 5 divisions that are in the north, go just send a platoon or company out and figure out how to do this. Just go mess with it. Um, and by the summer of 1941, they said, well, we may need as many as 10 mountain divisions. So the Army was thinking about this before it was even more with that one. Again, and that's why I said, but the Army did not know what they're going to need to raise any of these units. This is a mobilizing Army. It had the 5 divisions to train in 1940 because it had basically, they had activated a number of National Guard units and were bringing in the draft. Conscription was going on. It was not popular. It was peacetime. People didn't want it. It passed by one vote in Congress, but the United is slowly preparing. We're used to an army that's big, and the U.S. Army was not in the 1940s, and it is kind of this period where the Army, you see the Army today, they're trying to keep force structure because they know how hard it is to get it back once you lose it. The other thing that surprised me, and I'm not alone in this, Christian Beckwith's podcast, 90-Pound Rucksack, the role that the American Alpine Club played. And that, yes, National Ski Association out there, they're important. American Alpine Club also played a very important one. And it's always been hinted at, but had never gone and looked at it. It was the American Alpine Club's engagements with the War Department that made them go, we're going to need a mountain camp. We're going to need someplace where it's cold and has snow so people can go train. That was from dealing with the Alpine Club. That's where they came up with it. They began to hire and bring in initially civilians and then, direct commission guys in to basically what would be a mountaineer mafia in the office of the quartermaster general that designed all this stuff. Bester Robinson, who was he's from San Francisco. He is a member of the rock climbing section of the Sierra Club. Those are the guys who opened up the Yosemite Valley. He is also a member of the Ski Mountaineer section of the Sierra Club, and that's what the rock climbing section becomes in every October. They are early backcountry skiers. They put a pack on, they skin in, they camp, they ski, they come out because you can do that in the Sierras without a lot of avalanche knowledge. Though they did know quite a bit. They were reading the most recent stuff. They had a good feel for it. So Robinson is a member of the National Ski Association. He is a member of the American Alpine Club. He basically heads up the equipment committees, and he in the spring of 1941, months before there's any mountain troops, they determines what all the specifications for the gear is going to be, for the jackets, for the packs and so forth. And this is about 20 civilians. There's one Army officer that goes along. They just go in outside Bishop and spend a week messing with all this stuff. And so when the mountain troops are being activated, there is equipment in the pipeline, but it's all been designed. It's all the specifications are by civilians. Now they still have to mess with it, but it is the role of people like the American Alpine Club that did it with that one. The third thing that surprised me is that mountain warfare training continued after 1957, after 1945 to 1957 here, as we talked about it. Said when the division deactivates here in Carson in the summer, and well, the last regiment went out after Thanksgiving, weekend after Thanksgiving, the Friday after Thanksgiving, 1945. the last regiment and the division headquarters deactivated. They'd actually gone skiing that weekend prior. A bunch of guys got a truck and went up and skied Berthoud Pass. Um, and so um, somehow that seems fitting. The regular Army personnel, the guys that decided that had regular commissions or were non-commissioned officers, they're all sent down to Camp Swift, Texas, to join the Second Infantry Division. But somewhere, and maybe someday I can figure this out, but the Army decides we're going to keep working on this. They send them back about 50, 60 officers. So Ruffner, who was the Div RD commander, comes back as the commander in his rank. Whole bunches of majors and lieutenant colonels come back, XOs, battalion commanders. They bring in a lot of the NCOs retire, and they bring them back as civilian instructors in 1945. So again, long history of civilian instructors playing a role with this. They come back out to Carson, Colorado Springs, and they set up a mouthful, but it's a mountain and winter warfare school and training center. And this is very detailed stuff. If not, there's looking for like command and staff college paper. There's stuff to look at. This is definitely the encapsulation of all their experiences from Hale and from World War II. And what they determine is that they're raising, it's a regimental combat team, the 38th RCT. And they say, okay, get it through the 6 weeks of basic, the 6 months, excuse me, of basic and unit training. And then we can start training as a mountain unit. Don't try to do it at the same time. That was a learning point. Got to have a completely formed unit ready to go. The second thing they did is the school part. They said, okay, we will take a cadre of people from the unit and we will train them to be their unit trainers. And once we train them, they will then go back and train their units, and the school will supervise that training to keep it safe. And then once the training is done, we will put them into field exercises, and then the instructors, the schoolhouse instructors, will become the evaluators. So they do that. They do that here. They do climbing training in North Cheyenne Canyon, a city park. They do a lot of marches and so forth along the old Camp Road up towards in that area back St. Peter's Dome, an area back there. They went back in and did some training. They would do hikes up, unit climbs up Pikes Peak. So they run through all of that through the 46. Then in November, December 46, they say, okay, we're going to do it again. Give us a cadre, but now for ski training. And they go back up to Hale. They based the battalion. They only had the regiment, they only had 2 battalions, but they basically chopped out the rest of the parking lot there at Ski Cooper. And it was ever turned into Ski Cooper, you drive up, there was a battalion on each side of the street in tents, and that's where they stayed. And they went up there and they trained ski instructors of the unit, and then they supervised those instructors training their units. And then they had a plan to put them for about a 2-week evaluation, kind of a mini D series from all their experiences. But the Army decides the regiment needs to go to a parade in Denver in March for Army Day, and that doesn't come through. But they do that. Now, that's the max end of the training. It will decline a bit, come back a bit when they're talking more about sending people to the Arctic in 48, 49, 50. By 51, the Korean War is clearly going to last for a while. And so they set up another mountain warfare school this time. And that's that's the organization, the Mountain and Cold Weather Training Command. And those are the guys who adopt the Ram's Head and bring that idea in. I do not know, but I wonder, because I know one of the early things I've seen from the base papers, 2 of the guys of that school, 2 officers, went from Twin Lakes in the winter over to Aspen. They toured up over Independence Pass and down. There is a herd still there of mountain sheep. And I wonder if that's where they saw it and went, oh, that would be useful. That would be cool. We should use that. Don't know. Maybe there's something in it somewhere. They would do that one. But it's also they besides just doing they do unit training. What becomes the 10th Special Forces Group comes out to Hale for its last training event before it gets sent to Germany. They train a whole bunches of mountain warfare instructors for Japan and for Austria. George Hayes, who was the divisional commander in Italy, ends up as the U.S. Military commander in Austria, and the French troops have their mountain troops there. And he's like, hey, we should have some of that. So he sets up a school at Saalfeld in Austria, which is where the Austrian Jaeger School is today. And so he says, hey, send me some instructors. And they still have connections to the American Alpine Club. They're still talking to those guys. They're still working with them at the same time. So they do as well with that one. They also set up some of the initial guys to kind of help establish the mountain stuff up at what becomes Northern Warfare Training Center as well. And what's interesting for me is that the Marine Corps' Mountain Warfare Training Center is based upon this experience because the 38th has a Marine captain and exchange officer who's a company commander. He is the guy the Marine Corps then taps in 50 to basically set up the cold weather replacement training for Korea and then what becomes the Mountain Warfare Training Center. So the Marine Corps really adopted and maintained and still maintains that unit level emphasis that went on from there. So the training went well on into the 50s, and it was much longer and deeper than I thought it was. And the last one is that a recurrent pattern that's happened. And that is number one, that the military knows a lot about mountain warfare, but not much. So it has to look to civilians. It has to adopt techniques and technologies, not flat out adapt, but they have to be adopted because it is different. That happened obviously in the 1940s. It happened around 1980. It happened around 2000. Maybe it's going to happen again. We'll see. 1980s, the EQUEX, which the old is extended cold weather clothing system. I think
Extreme
that
cold weather.
extreme. Thank you. Um, I mean, and that was the newest stuff. I got issued, the tops and bottoms of that in Pendleton in 87 in 89 when I showed up. I was like, what the heck is this stuff? Um, well, the Polypro and the fleece, well, that's Yvon Chouinard in his catalogs in the 70s, early 80s that brought in Polypro, that brought in fleece. And the Army just PO Sultan Natick Labs, they just, as far as I can tell, just adopted it and used that. The 2000, the PCU, the protective combat uniform, another thing there that, I mean, that's a lot of civilian stuff, but, Mark Twight of Extreme Alpinism, I mean, he was heavily involved in that and proudly involved in it. You can go find videos of him on YouTube talking about how to use the PCU and how he adapted it with that one. I always point out that the military adopts soft shells as clothing long before the civilian market does. My wife, has worked outdoor retail for decades and remembers trying to sell a soft shell jacket in the early 2000s. People are like, what is this? Never seen that. So it's one of those things that go with that one there. So civilian practices and civilian practitioners are actually a part of part of this military practice of mountain warfare.
That's interesting. I didn't know all that happened between the 40s and the 80s. So if you look at the life cycle of the 10th Mountain Division, its inception, the war, then it going away, getting resurrected in the 1980s as a light infantry unit, and still being one of the elite infantry units, but as a generalist infantry force. From a historical standpoint, what do you think of specialized forces versus generalized forces?
Yeah, we do see these cycles. The Second World War, we see this quite a bit. You know, units get used in a way they were never intended for. Airborne units end up fighting as line infantry. Commando units, get stuck in the line to just try to hang, because they don't have enough infantry, which you never have enough infantry. Um, American tanks were designed not intended to fight enemy tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers, but they kept coming up having to fight tanks, which was not what they were. So that happens anytime you specially design a unit to do something. You almost guarantee it will never do that unit, with relatively small exceptions. With that, I mean, one example, the British did have a mountain division, the 52nd Lowland Division Mountain, my favorite title of all times. And it spent years training, and was actually seems to have been quite good, but it got caught to be part of the deception plan for D-Day. Told the Germans, hey, they're going back to Norway. We're going to Norway and see, look at this mountain division. And even to the extent when the British asked for them in Italy in May of 1944, they were told, no, you can't have them. Meaning D-Day is a couple of weeks away. It's not even a week away when they ask for it, and they still won't let them go. They end up fighting in the Netherlands below sea level. So go figure. Um, so I wonder if there's historically a, a problem with scale. If you try to make a specialized unit too big, it becomes too easy to use it to another way. So you have to keep them relatively small, but then why are you maintaining a unit? I think the position that I've looked at is this is for expeditionary armies like the United States, um, you were not going to be able to have um, specialized units for for everything. If you take like the French, the Italians, the Austrians, the Germans, their bases are in the Alps. They have to do alpine movement just to get to a training area. So it's a bit of a different story. And they have population living in the mountains. We don't have that in the States to that same extent. So I think the critical thing is the capacity to take general purpose units and train them uh, up to a level, up to a certain level. But that takes a schoolhouse, perhaps several, depending on where you're at. That takes having warehouses full of gear ready to go. That takes subject matter experts who know how to maintain over snow vehicles and can it's not that it isn't cheap, but it's the way that family has to be done. In the mountains, it takes a year. It takes all 4 seasons to train. I mean, the spring is actually one of the hardest times to move in the mountains and be there because there's snow and there's not. And uh, so that's where if you're going to, for the US specifically, we've got to have, I would argue, from a historical perspective, the ability to train units up to a certain level standard, but that requires a certain amount of sunk cost in order to be able to do that. Other specializations like, jungle or urban or those types of things, difficult places to fight. I can train you in a season. Give me a month, give me a couple months, I can run you through stuff. Mountains, I'm like, okay, here's the mountains in summer. Um, that's not going to do you any good 6 months later, because you're not going to have any of the gear or equipment, or you're like, what? Avalanche? What? Where you'll move in the summer, you're not moving there in the winter. So I think that is the challenge. It is that all 4 seasons in an entire year to take to get a unit up to any level. And again, like I said, I think what's not really understood is the sunk costs of having the instructors and the SMEs and the warehouses, and though that's getting better, but um, and again, what do you really? I mean, I don't think we have a good feeling for it. I will say this, however, I am around to opinion that the National Guard battalions should be reorganized as no kidding mountain infantry units. Like I say, we have a TO from '97 that the Vermont boys worked on for over a decade. Seemed to be a pretty good work for them. I think we should start there again, and no kidding, get them back because then they can take advantage of location. And we should expand it, get out. Let's get units in the Sierras and the Pacific Northwest and the Wasatch. I mean, I don't let's take advantage of those things, and raise no kidding mountain units. Now you have a base because again, mountain warfare, civilian practice is very important, and every army that has looked at this long and hard comes back to the conclusion we got to have some people um, who do this stuff on their own.
Okay, so then speaking of civilian practice, what can a modern day soldier or military member or even non military member learn from these early members of the 10th Mountain Division?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say a couple things I would leave you with is the first thing is to remember that those early 10th Mountain guys, most of them are not outdoor experts by any stretch of the imagination. Um, they probably had less than 100 guys who really knew how to climb. They were trying to find mountaineers. They could only come up with like 20 out of, they had almost 7, 8,000 guys that hailed that time. Um, ski instructors, they could get guys who know how to ski, but, I mentioned Bester Robinson early. He quickly figured out they needed backcountry skiers, and there was probably less than 100 of those kind of guys in the States at the time. So, so we're talking less than 100 were climbers, less than 300 are probably skied to instructor level. So remember, these guys had to learn. too. I think that's the first thing is they had to learn how to do it in many cases as well, but they had the desire to do it. And that's, I think, the thing that continually comes through whenever I look at it is people wanted to be in the mountains. They wanted to be in the mountain troops. They knew they were doing something unique and interesting. Guy from Chicago, he did, I'm going to be drafted. Fine. I'll go on the mountain trips. I like the mountains. I'll go do that. And, he spends every weekend, hiking up to lakes and he's interested in birds and nature and that's what he liked. And that's, so he took opportunity of it. I wish I could remember the gentleman's name because I've just lost it, but he was from, I think from Alabama. And they said, "Hey, who wants to go to the mountain troops?" And he said, "That looks interesting. I'll volunteer." And they asked him, "Do you ski?" He's like, "Yes, sir." I said, "Okay, what kind of wax do you put on your skis?" He said, "Beeswax." And officer laughed and just said, "Okay, good luck." But he ends up, he comes back to Colorado after the war. And I think this is a guy who like skied 8 basin every day for the rest of his life from opening day to closing day, even when he's in his 80s. He went and skied every day. That was his jam. That's who he was. So I would say that it's the desire that I think you can take away is that desire to do it, to be there and to do it is important. And then, I mean, as you know from your stuff, that your own skill and ability in the mountains is important. Um, you need to, go get out there, go do it. Doesn't matter what your level is, go out there and go do it. And if you're able, try to progress. Try to you know, take ski lessons, hire a guide. Go to a gym, I mean, whatever, wilderness first responder, which is an entry level cert for almost anything anymore in the outdoors. Pursue those things. Make that link, take that step. I see, the link between mountaineering and mountain warfare is really strong. So, take that step. And I think that's something that we can learn and take away from the other side of from them is that, as we well know, when all those guys came back, many, many, many of them went back to the mountains. Like I said, in my neighborhood, there's several houses that were built by 10th Mountain veterans because they want to be back in Colorado. They want to be back near the mountains. I think that's uh, I think that's a good thing to take away.
Yeah, that is a good takeaway. It reminds me of people who I know who are snowboarders that refuse to learn how to ski or ski well to the point where they split board to get into the backcountry instead of just learning how to ski. And then they'll say, "Oh, I have to switch over and learn eventually." Next thing you know, 5 years go by and they could have become a really good skier by now. But this doesn't just have to apply towards mountaineering. Any goal you have, just break it up into smaller bites and get after it, because it probably isn't as hard as that guy from Alabama volunteering to be a mountaineer and having to learn as quick as he did. So, is there anything else about the book that you want to mention before we go?
I'll just finish say what's been interesting about this project and this book is there's the interest that has come from the practitioner community, people who are thinking about military operations in the mountains on mountain warfare has been gratifying. It is one of the audiences I wrote for. The academic side when it comes out, people will be interested in read, but it's been interesting. It is for me that is this group that has, and so that is for me that's a very it's quite heartwarming and appreciated because I know how hard it is to do both things.
Yeah, well, I think your book is going to speak to both those mountaineers and people interested in history. Again, it comes out in November. Thanks for taking the time to have this talk.
All right. Well, thank you very much.